1 week season.
What is going on, OWS fam? Welcome to the Week 8 edition, Week 8, wow, of the OWS Angles podcast. I am your host, I am your guest, I am JMToWin. Whether you are watching this on YouTube or listening to this on the OWS podcast feed, throw this baby on 1.5x speed or 2x speed, and let's get started with a slate I really like this week. Before we get started, let me first tell you this. I am probably going to be treating this slate a little bit like a single entry slate. So I will still be playing MME. I might actually scale down from 150 rosters down to about 100. Maybe not. I'm not sure yet. But I am going to have kind of a core approach and then mix and match players around that. So every week is different. Every week is unique. Every week in DFS is its own puzzle that we are trying to solve. We're trying to figure out what is our clearest path to a first place finish, keeping in mind that a first place finish is where most of the money is, or at least those top 0.01% finishes are where most of the money is. And the more we think about DFS as a new puzzle that we're trying to solve each week, and that idea of like phrasing it specifically like that came to me from Cal Spears, one of the founders of Roto Grinders. And I was in Nashville back when I was with Roto Grinders. I'd fly out there a few times a year for work events and other work things. And I went to a birthday party with Cal, a friend of his, and he was explaining to this guy who'd never heard of DFS what DFS was. And he said that DFS, NFL DFS, is a unique puzzle that you get to solve each week. And that was the most apt description of DFS that I'd ever heard. And I've referenced that from time to time over the years. And the more we think of things that way, as opposed to trying to pick players who we like or put together a roster of guys who can score a lot of points, the more we think of it as a unique puzzle that we're trying to piece together each week, the more we can get these first place finishes, especially if we're then pairing that with the understanding that what we're trying to build is a roster that can get to first place out of our set of rosters. So we talk about that from time to time, that oftentimes what we're trying to do is create one roster that can get to first place. And that might mean creating rosters in such a way that if roster Z succeeds, it also means that rosters A through F are getting hurt, right? Because it's unlikely that this game is playing out both of these ways, such that rosters A through F are benefiting and roster Z is also benefiting. But what that does is, as this roster gets hurt, this also benefits this other roster. And so if we are spreading ourselves too thin in the way that we're building, then we're never going to win, right? From just like, hey, this can help us and hurt this roster, but help this roster. And then this over here can help this roster and hurt this roster. And we do that just all across the board. Well, that's not going to help us, right? Which is why we also look for more concentrated bets that we can make. So whether that's a game environment that we're going to build around, or one or two higher confidence plays that we can put across a lot of our rosters, the more we can do that, then the fewer things we're giving ourselves that we need to get right. So we're going to get into some DFS training here, but from that perspective, fewer things we need to get right. It is dramatically more difficult to get 9 things right than to get 5 things right. And so if you are just trying to mix and match 9 different players across a bunch of rosters, you're probably not going to win DFS tournaments. If instead you're saying, I'm betting on this one game environment over here and I'm covering 3 spots if I get this thing right, and I'm mixing and matching this offense across a bunch of rosters so that if I get this one thing right, I know that at least a third of my rosters are getting this position right. And hopefully another third are just like getting a solid score from a player on that team. And maybe a third of my rosters are getting hurt by this mix and match, but I'm now pushing these other rosters up as this roster falls down. Well, these are the types of things that we can do to really maximize our chances of a first place finish. So again, every week is unique. Every week is different. And most weeks, what I'm looking to do, because most tournament wins come from doing this, is I'm looking to find that game environment that can develop into a game environment you had to have in order to win on that particular week. This week is a little bit different. So we are going to get to the ins and outs of why I'm kind of building the way I'm building and what I'm seeing on this slate, some of the unique angles on this particular slate here in just a moment. Before we get to that, I wanted to talk quickly about so we have the Winner Circle Pod for Inner Circle members. We have the Winner Circle Pod each week, midweek, and it is a macro DFS strategy and theory pod through the lens of the slate behind us or the slate ahead of us. So we talk about things that help us become better DFS players, some of the things that we touch on in the Angles podcast, but obviously go much deeper in that podcast. And then we also have questions that come in and often try to get to those. So we had a question come in this last week from somebody who had missed out, had made a late change to a roster in their showdown entry and missed out on a 40K win and still had a win, but would have had a 40K win. And they were talking about, basically asking like, has this ever happened to you where you've changed the roster and, it just ended up missing out on a huge amount of money as a result? And how do you handle something like that? So we dove into the answer to that question in the Winner Circle podcast. I won't dive into that here. If you are an Inner Circle member, that podcast is on the Inner Circle podcast feed. You can find it on the podcast page on OWS. It's gated so that only you as an Inner Circle member have the link to that podcast feed. You also get the Slate podcast on Saturdays with Sandomir and Hilo. If you're an Inner Circle member and you're not leveraging that podcast feed, I would strongly encourage you to do that because the Slate podcast is one of the most valuable podcasts for Slate preparation each week, Slate strategy, and so on. But I dove into the answer to that question there, but also in that question, he said, life-changing money. He said, I missed out on life-changing money. And it triggered some thoughts in my mind that I wanted to talk about real quickly here. And that is, I've been playing DFS for 11 years. I've had, six-figure wins multiple times. I've had big weekends, most years. I've had 1 or 2 or 3 big weekends, depending on how many sports I've been playing in those years. These days, I just play NFL. But even the last couple of years playing just NFL, I had 4 big weekends last year. I had 2 big weekends the year before. And so I'm out of, and then I run a business, right, where like huge sums of money are moving around. And so I'm out of the habit of thinking about that 40K being life-changing money. I've never been on a fixed income. I did freelance writing before I started writing DFS content. So I could scale up and down my income based on how many jobs I took on, but that was much more capped because the amount of time I had available to work contributed directly or correlated directly to the amount of money that I was making. And so it made me think about the first time I had a big win in DFS, and it was a 30K win. And it was, I was not writing for Roto-Grinders yet. I was still doing freelance writing and I picked up DFS that year. It was MLB and I was doing really well with it, but I hadn't had a huge win yet. And I had this 30K win and it felt life-changing. And my wife and I were talking about, we were thinking about moving to Denver at the time. And this was 10, 11 years ago, right? So things were different back then, but there was kind of a developing neighborhood in Denver. And there was this condo that we really liked that was $200K. And we're like, man, we could put a down payment on this with this money. And I've kind of forgotten what a huge win of something like that can feel like if you're on a fixed income or if you're younger and your like economic power or your ability to command higher salary hasn't been built up quite yet, right? If you're in your 20s or if you're just paycheck to paycheck and you have a family, 40K can make a massive difference, right? And so I was thinking about that. And then I was thinking about our Props Insider package and just thinking about the fact that sometimes this number, right, you see it on the homepage all the time, that last year our profit was over 25,000 in Props Insider. And it can almost seem like that's such a big number that you almost gloss over it. It almost seems like a sales tactic. So first off, I want to highlight that if you are in a state with legal sports betting, sports betting lines and parlays and all of that is generally a negative EV proposition. You're probably going to lose money over time doing that. Props are different because props are inefficient. And if you bet props the right way, you're going to make money over time doing it. The cool thing about Props Insider is you don't have to do the research yourself and grind several hours of research on a daily basis. You just pay for Props Insider. They do all the research for you. They give you the bets. You bet the bets. You don't even have to follow the sports. And so just that in that context of like, oh, wow, like 25K, 30K, 40K, that's a huge sum if you're on fixed income or if you are younger or if you have a family and you're trying to meet the bills and you just have this windfall of money, right? That changes things dramatically. And I think that number is so big that people kind of just gloss over it. The fact that we made 25K in Props Insider last year. So for context, that is on a $100 betting unit. So if you're betting $100 per bet, you would have made 25K last year. If you are in this situation, you might not be, because you're going to have swings where it's like negative 11 units, negative 15 units before then there's another upswing and it's maybe up plus 20 units, plus 25 units, whatever it might be. So you might not be able to withstand a $1,500 downswing, but you might be able to withstand a $300 downswing and do $20 units. And if you did $20 units, that would have been 5K in profit last year. And then you can roll that into bigger bets next year. So I just want to encourage you guys, if you have not checked out Props Insider and you're in a state with legal sports betting, our hottest time of year for for Props Insider is I've got the DFS Lab background on here, but the hottest time of year for this is NBA, especially the start of NBA. So we've got the $35 weekly pass. I would encourage the monthly pass because that gives you a larger sample size. But just something I wanted to shout out here at the top of the pod, and just something we talk about a lot in Winner Circle. We've talked about it before in the Angles podcast, but my favorite thing about DFS is that you could play DFS, lose money, and make way more money in other areas of your life as a result of playing DFS. Since I started playing DFS and being around the people I've been fortunate enough to work with, but also the people I've been just fortunate enough to listen to, whether it's Cal and Cam, who started Roto Grinders, or Jonathan Bales, or CSU Ram, or the years that I got to work with Adam and Evan, or working with Pete, like all these people that I learned so much from, and all the other people that I've gotten to listen to and learn so much from, just keeping in mind that there's so much in terms of just plus EV thinking that you can pick up through playing DFS that can help you in all other areas of life. I will leave off that discussion there because that's something we talk about a lot in Winner Circle, and kind of look at some of those areas where we can really leverage our DFS thinking into other areas and just kind of improve as a result. Last thing I want to mention, if you grab the month pass for Props Insider and you do it for like a week and you're like, man, this isn't a fit for me, just shoot us an email. We're never trying to lock people into something they don't want to have or don't want to do. So we will gladly send you your money back. So kind of consider it risk-free, grab it and test it out for a week or so. And if you don't like it, just let us know and we'll send you that money back. Okay, on to the slate. So it's a unique slate for me. It is, I kind of feel like I'm in lockstep with the field at running back and tight end, very much seeing things the same way as the field at running back and tight end. At the same time, there's like 9 running backs, I think, that are in my player grid this week. And most of them don't really separate from one another. And what I mean by that is when I'm looking at the research, I'm not like, oh, this guy is clearly better than this guy, or this guy's clearly better than this guy. I'll give you an example. Kareem Hunt, and we dig into the numbers in the player grid, but basically in the role that he has, our expectation on this Chiefs offense against the Raiders, expecting that he sees 20 plus touches, our expectation that he's going to score around 14 to 26 DraftKings points. Do I know if it's going to be 14 or 16 or 14 or 26? I don't. Or where in that range is going to fall? I don't. Pete Overzet asked me about DeAndre Swift on the Block Party show today. And I said, yeah, like I really like DeAndre Swift, right? He could score 12. He could score 30. And I don't know where in that range he's going to land. And I think that the typical tendency of especially newer DFS players and maybe even some content providers is to stamp your thoughts in place and be like, well, this guy is going to hit because of this, or this guy's a better player than this guy because of this. Whereas realistically, we should let the picture on the box tell us what the puzzle for that week looks like. We should let the information available to us provide us with the information we're working with. And so in this week, what I'm seeing is not a lot of separation between Kareem Hunt and DeAndre Swift and these other running backs that I like in the 6K price range. Devon Achane, who has a really high ceiling, but also kind of a lower floor than somebody like Kareem Hunt might have. Not a lot separating. Javonte Williams, another guy in that price range. Not a lot separating Saquon Barkley and Joe Mixon and Kenneth Walker. Where does Kenneth Walker score 2 touchdowns this week? Probably not against the Bills. Does he rush for 100 yards? Probably not against the Bills. But does he see 6, 7, 8 receptions against this Bills defense that forces the most targets in the NFL, the highest target percentage, I should say, in the NFL to running backs, and ranks 31st in DVOA, defending running backs through the air? Yeah, like Kenneth Walker could have 6, 7 catches, and then that gives you a pretty high floor there. And then he could have some yards on the ground. And then what if he adds a touchdown? What if he adds 2, right? So there's like a broad range on him. Saquon Barkley, he's had games this year where he's put up 23 and 24 points before touchdowns. So if you had a 2 touchdown game in there, he's getting up to 36 DraftKings points. He's also had a 3 touchdown game this year. Do you have a 4 touchdown game? Is that what it was, right? Like basically crazy scoring from Saquon Barkley, but he also has a game of 7 pre-touchdown DraftKings points and a game of 13 pre-touchdown DraftKings points. So it's kind of all with Saquon. It's all about the explosive plays. Does he hit the explosive plays? If he doesn't, then all of a sudden, you're down at this lower end. And so he has this broad range of outcomes, but also has this really high ceiling. Joe Mixon doesn't have this explosive upside. He's not going to hit for these huge plays that Saquon's going to hit for, but Joe Mixon has just been right on schedule all season, right? It's like He's picking up 3 yards. He's picking up 7 yards. He's picking up 5 yards. He's picking up 9 yards. And he's consistently getting positive yardage, which is why the Texans have been so happy to continue to give him the ball. So as long as he's getting 25 plus touches against the Colts, and as long as the Texans are in control of this game, which they probably will be, he has a pretty good shot at that 100-yard bonus. And then it's just a question of, does he score the touchdowns or does he not score the touchdowns? And so it's things like that I don't want to, on my roster, say, all right, I am going to take a stand and I'm going to play this guy at a much higher rate than this other guy, right? Breece Hall might be in a separate category. We'll get to him in the player grid. We'll leave it at that for now. But Breece Hall might be in a slightly separate category where the floor is a little bit higher and the ceiling is the same as these other guys. So it's not that he has a higher ceiling than these other guys. It's just that he's less likely to hurt you than these other guys. He's priced a little bit lower than these other guys. But the rest of these guys, it's like, yeah, nothing really separates amongst them. So what I want to do, if I can, is just mix and match combinations of these running backs across a bunch of rosters. Now, if I were mixing and matching combinations of these running backs and then also didn't really have anything narrowed down at wide receiver, didn't really have anything narrowed down at quarterback, then that becomes what we talked about at the top of the pod, where it's like, yeah, well, you might just be spreading yourself too thin that you're never going to get all the right pieces on a roster together without getting totally lucky. But in a situation where you can say, I really like this at quarterback, or I really like this at wide receiver, I'm going to narrow down my pool and just play 80% of this one wide receiver. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, right? Then I lose this weekend. I used to play just single entry. I used to play the $1,500 single entry every single week. And that was really all that I played. In fact, one year, it's even crazy still to think about this. DFS was a softer game back then, but it was 2014. And it used to be maybe it was a 4-entry max on the $1,000 buy-in contest back then. And I put in 4 entries, and I liked my single roster so much that I double entered it 2 times and basically just made one small change on the roster. So it was basically one roster with one small variation, and it was double entered one version of it and double entered the other version of it, and ended up finishing first, second, third, and fourth with those 2 single entry rosters, right? And so I am comfortable putting all my chips onto one roster or onto one set of plays. And this is the type of week where I might be doing that in certain spots. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. That's okay. It's one weekend. And I know that if I played out this weekend 100 times, I would make money on it based on the guys that I'm gravitating toward and why I'm gravitating toward them. So we'll see how much of that we're able to touch on in the Angles podcast, how much of that we leave for the player grid in terms of the individual players. But just to talk about how I'm seeing this slate and how I'm approaching it myself. Now, I also think it's worth highlighting here that the way I'm seeing it is obviously going to be different from the way some other people are seeing it. Not everybody is going to say, okay, I'm going to have 80% of this wide receiver. The wide receiver is Tyreek Hill. So that one, I do think he's going to be about 60% owned. Okay, let's pause a moment and touch on that. So Tyreek Hill, he's 7K. He should be 8,600 to 8,800. Last year, Tyreek Hill got hurt in week 14. He missed week 15. And then week 16, 17, and 18, his production kind of tailed off. So came back from the injury, his production tailed off. So let's throw that out. Let's take the first 12 games before he got hurt. In those first 12 games, actually, let's first say this. I say this all the time, but refresher. DraftKings, we speak in generalities here, but DraftKings generally prices players in such a way that they will hit roughly 4x their salary, roughly 25% of the time. So there's a lot of nuance in there. There's some players who hit that score less often, but they also hit for like way more than 4x when they hit. A guy like Aaron Jones. He doesn't, like traditionally, he doesn't hit 4x 25% of the time, but he also hits like 5x's and 6x's when he hits big. And so they kind of have to price him up at a higher level. But generally speaking, this is how DraftKings handles pricing. A player is going to hit roughly 4x their salary multiplier, roughly 25% of the time. Last year, Tyreek Hill in those 12 healthy games hit roughly 4x his salary for this week, 75% of the time. It's hard to overstate just how outrageous that is. Like, he was consistently one of the sharpest plays last year when he was 8,600, 8,700, 8,800. So now he's 7K and Tua's back. It's just a mispricing. And it's not like we're saying, oh, he's mispriced and he can have a big game. It's like he's mispriced, and he was probably mispriced last year in the mid to high 8Ks because he was hitting, we always say you're looking for 4x salary multiplier, but there's also a component of anytime you get 30 points or are approaching 30 points, it doesn't matter that much what you paid for it. There's kind of the two ends of the spectrum, where on the higher ends of the spectrum, if you don't get 4x the salary you paid, that's okay, as long as you're approaching or passing 30 points. On the lower end of the pricing range, if you get if you get a guy who's 3K, if you get 12 points, if you get 4x, that's good, but you shouldn't be just targeting 4x. You should be targeting guys who can go for 20. So on the lower end of the price range, you really want to be targeting at least 20. If they don't get 20, but they get you 4x, that's still pretty good. On the higher end of the price range, you want to be targeting 30. And, even if it's a 6K guy, right? You want him to be a 6K guy who is capable of going for 30 DraftKings points. And so Tyreek Hill, going for 25.8 or more DraftKings points in 9 of 12 games last year. Most of those was higher than 25.8, right? Getting up into the actual 4x or 4.5x or 5x his salary for this week. It's just a clear mispricing. So that's a place where I'm going to be comfortable saying, if I lose this week, and I almost never go 100% of a player in MME. Every once in a while, I wish that I had. Last year when we had Josh Allen against Jalen Hurts and the Eagles, and nobody was on Josh Allen, and we were so high on him, and I ended up going like 60% Josh Allen, but I considered 100%, and like my other 40% of rosters bombed that week, but all my Josh Allen rosters were in contention for first place that week. So, but I almost never do it because I want to be able to say, well, if this guy bombs, I still have some outs on the weekend. And so I can leave 20% of rosters with no Tyreek Hill, and I can say, what might win if Tyreek Hill misses? Like, is it something else on the Dolphins that will win for me? Or is it approaching things in a totally different way? And so I will probably give myself some outs, but for the most part, I will be comfortable attacking that spot. There are some other places that we'll save for the player grid on where I'm comfortable attacking kind of like really heavy ownership. A quarterback, I'm comfortable attacking at probably 40 to 50% exposure. A wide receiver, another wide receiver who I'm comfortable attacking at 60 to 80% exposure, I would say. And then a mix and match of one particular team that I'm comfortable attacking at potentially as much as 100% exposure, right? Where that's different because you don't have 100% of one guy. If this offense completely fails in this spot, it would just be like, well, that's so unlikely that I'm fine losing the weekend because of that. The offense will almost certainly succeed. So then it's like, which one of these guys benefits? You mix and match these guys, and ideally it's 4 different guys I'll mix and match. Ideally, 1 or 2 of them put up a 4x score, and then 1 or 2 of them puts up a score that at least doesn't hurt you, right? It's like a solid score, 3x, 3.5x, and then you're probably going to get one guy who kind of bombs, and then some of your rosters gone because that one guy bombed, and you can generally get a feel for which guy that might be, and so he's your loser out of the bunch. And so yeah, that's kind of how I'm going to approach this week, is this heavy like concentration at quarterback, really heavy concentration at a couple wide receiver spots, heavy concentration on this one particular offense, and kind of mixing and matching those across rosters. And then that will allow me to say, there's not a lot separating at running back, but I like a lot of different guys. And it's probable that 2 or 3 guys from this group of all these good running backs this week put up a really nice score. So this gives me an opportunity, if my core hits, then I'm mixing and matching these running backs across a bunch of rosters that have that core. And that gives me an opportunity to get the exact right combination of running backs on a roster where my core is hitting. So I've had weeks like this where my core has gone off, and then you're mixing and matching things, and you're just in position for first place finishes, right? You're going to have something that's knocking on the door for a first place finish. I've had other weeks where this has happened more often for me on weeks like this, where my core does solid. It doesn't go off. It's not the best plays on the slate, but it's solid. And then you're mixing and matching pieces from there, and you still have that opportunity for first place because you have an opportunity for the right pieces, the best pieces at these other positions to land on one of these rosters, and you're solid at these spots, and then you're jumping past everything else at these other spots. And then I've had weeks where the core completely bombs, and you just say, well, that was this weekend gone. I still feel confident that if I could have played out the slate 100 times, this core would have made me money. Just did not work out in the small sample size of this week. But, we're playing the long game with DFS. We are always trying to position ourselves for what would win us money on this particular slate if we could play out this particular slate 100 times. We only get to play it out once. So if we fail, then it is what it is, right? And you get in the habit of assessing your play and saying, was I wrong, or did things just break against me? And you have to be willing to say, I've had big weekends. This is getting into kind of like a winner circle type podcast, but I've had big weekends where I played poorly, and I'm assessing things on Sunday night and realizing, I really didn't play that well. I ended up with like one roster where things fell into place on this particular roster. I remember one weekend it was 2022, and I had a Joe Burrow roster. And it was a week Joe Burrow was going to be 2% owned, and I kept saying, it was later in the season, maybe November, and I kept saying, wouldn't it just make sense, like, that nobody's on Joe Burrow? Wouldn't it just be like DFS for Joe Burrow to have the biggest like weekend of any quarterback, for him to be the highest scoring quarterback? And so just off that thought, I had 5% Joe Burrow roster, something like that. He wasn't a heavy part of my player pool. I didn't play well. My player pool didn't perform well, but I had this one Joe Burrow roster, one of my Joe Burrow rosters, where the right pieces were on the Burrow build, because I've got 5% mixing and matching. The right pieces were on the Burrow build, and then the right pieces were kind of mix and match on there. And then it was, it was a roster that I'd selected for single entry play and ended up having a big weekend because it finished first place, right? So there's these opportunities to have bad weekends of play that go well, and you have to assess them after the fact and say, man, I got lucky there. I should have played better this weekend. Here are the mistakes I made. Let me learn from them. And they're going to have lots of weekends, ideally, where you play really well. Ideally, you're playing really well 80+% of the time. Ideally, you're not giving many weekends away. And ideally, that other 20%, like half of those weekends or 2/3 of those weekends, you played pretty well. And it's like, oh, I made a few mistakes. I still played pretty well. I played like 85% of my capability, 90% of my capability. And then you're gonna have a few weekends where after the fact, you're like, man, I really didn't have it this week. And I did not push through and have my best week of play. There's a fly flying right in front of my face. And so you're gonna have weekends like that as well. But on this particular weekend, if I lose, I'm okay with it as long as I can assess beforehand. My dad actually asked me last Sunday, he said, because I'm here in New England, living next door to them, and we fly back on Tuesday. So next week I'll be back in my normal environment. Won't have the beach right outside my house, which will be a kind of a tough shift to get used to. But my dad asked me last Sunday, he said, how are your rosters doing? And I said, oh, they're doing well. And I said, of course, it doesn't really matter. What matters is, like, did I feel good before games kicked off? And I said I had a good week of play, and that's really what matters. And that is what matters. And that should be the way that we're able to approach DFS is, did you look at your set of rosters right before games kicked off and say, okay, let me assess my play. Did I really think through all the angles on the slate? Do I feel like I put myself in a plus EV position, a position where I would make money on this slate if we played it out 100 times? And if the answer is yes, then that's it, right? And then things play out. You make money, you lose money, but you know that over time you're going to be making money as long as you're consistently putting in weekends like that. So all that to say, not everybody's going to be approaching this weekend like this. This is a unique weekend where, I used to be the first couple of years of OWS, I was the only content provider on the site. And so I got in the habit of being like, man, I'm giving people, it was a lower subscription price back then, but it was still like, I'm giving some of these subscribers all the information that they're going to get on this weekend. So I have to make sure that I'm giving them not just what I like, but all the angles on this particular slate. That's less the case now, right? And so I'm sure I have not read any other or listened to any other DFS OWS content yet this week. I'm excited to listen to Searching for Ceiling tonight on the OWS podcast feed and YouTube channel. I'm excited to listen to the slate tomorrow. I'm excited to read through the NFL Edge tonight and to read through the scroll tomorrow and see what everybody else thinks. They will probably have different angles that they're approaching the slate with than the angle I'm approaching the slate with. You might also have subscriptions to other sites or read other sites. I'm excited to be on my podcast with Squirrel Patrol and see how he's seeing this particular slate. But point is, I'm not the only, the way that I'm seeing the slate is not the only way to see the slate. And so kind of take this as one data point, one way to look at things, but this is how I'm looking at things. And this is how I'm approaching things this week. All right, back to my notes. So I'm in lockstep with the field at running back and tight end. I'm very close to the way that the field is. This is based off of early ownership projections. I'm very close to the way that the field is seeing things at defense special teams. And this is positive for me because we're trying to win a tournament and you have to be different somewhere. And ideally, you're being contrarian by thinking for yourself. Ideally, you're not being contrarian because you look at ownership and you say, oh, here are different ways to play this slate. Ideally, you're being contrarian. This is the fly episode. Ideally, you're being contrarian because you're thinking for yourself. You're seeing things and then you open up ownership projections and you're like, I was talking to my computer this week when I first looked at ownership projections, like, what are you guys doing? What are you seeing here, right? I am in a different country code than the field at quarterback. And I am in a different area code than the field at wide receiver. So because that's the case, I am able to attack this week the way that I am attacking this week, where I can mix and match these running backs, not take a stance, not try to think myself out of money at that position. I can have my concentrated bets at quarterback and at wide receiver. Obviously, the field's going to be on Tyreek Hill, but the way I'm approaching things elsewhere is going to be a little bit different than the way the field is approaching things. And then it doesn't matter that I'm on higher owned running backs and tight ends because I'm going to be approaching things so differently than the way that the field is going to be approaching things. Okay, we dove into this on the Winner Circle podcast, but I want to touch on this here as well. And that is part of what is unique about DraftKings DFS right now is two things that are unique. One, the way that scoring is being produced in the NFL, where fantasy scoring is just lower. So we'll touch on why that's the case. And then also the way that DraftKings is handling pricing is very different from the past. So the data point I want to bring up this last week, P Rich, who on OWS, he's P Rich, one of our content providers. On DraftKings, he's Teach Me How To is his name. Teach Me How To, P Rich, took down the slant this last week. So usually the slant is a 20,000 entry tournament. This last week, because week 7, because they had the $10 Millie Maker, they sized it down to a 10,000 entry tournament. So P Rich finished first place in the slant, kind of one of the standard bearer MME tournaments that DraftKings runs. And it's one that I think we won the slant 4 times last year at OWS, maybe more than that. We had 2 weeks where I finished second. One of those weeks I got beat by an OWS sub. And it's a tournament that we tend to do really well in, and I like to use it as a gauge of how the OWS community is doing. I believe this was our first slant win this year. So P Rich took down the slant. He took it down with 180 points. But second place in the slant was 165 points. So if people are compiling data, there's a lot of people out there who Levitan does a good job with this. I know others do a good job with this of compiling data and sort of sifting through that data to give us information on what is required to win tournaments, right? So if people are doing that, the data point is that you needed 180 points to win the slant this last week, because in order to beat P Rich, you needed 180 points. But what if P Rich, just one person, decided, I'm not entering the slant this week? Or what if it filled up before he got a chance to enter the slant? Or what if he made a different set of decisions? Then the data point for what was required to win the slant this last week, a 10,000 entry MME tournament where people can mix and match lots of different things, take home run swings, what was required to win that contest was 165 points. So if one person decided, I'm not playing this contest this week, then that data point shifts down to 165 DraftKings points was what was required to win a 10,000 entry MME tournament. I mean, that's unheard of. Even the week before, when I had my sweat for the slant, first place was 203.6 DraftKings points, and first place in the flea flicker was 203.7, or maybe I have those flipped around. The flea flicker is 60,000 entry tournament, 203.7. This last week, P Rich did not enter the flea flicker, but if he had, he would have won that as well. Now, what the winner of that was 178 point something, so higher score there. But point being, these are low scores for what we're used to seeing winning tournaments. So part of that is, as we talked about, defenses are taking away downfield passing. In fact, I went through and I tallied up. Here are the 30-point scores that have been produced this year from wide receivers who are on this week's slate. Jamar Chase has done it twice. In those games, the scores were 33-38 and 38-41. So it took absolute shootouts in order for Jamar Chase to produce his 2 30-plus point scores. Drake London has done it once. In that game, Kirk Cousins threw the ball 50-plus times. Kirk Cousins threw the ball for over 500 yards. The final score in that game was 36-30, an absolute shootout for Drake London to produce 30-plus DraftKings points. Marvin Harrison Jr. has produced 30-plus points once. Kind of easy to forget that at this point, given what he's done recently. But early in the season, week 2, he produced 32-point-something DraftKings points. That game, not a shootout, but Arizona scored 41 points in that game. In order for him to produce 30-plus DraftKings points, he needed 41 points. Garrett Wilson, it was a lower scoring game. He produced 30-plus DraftKings points, but he needed 22 targets to get there. Jaden Daniels has done it twice in games of 29-34 and 29-31. Actually, I should flip those scores around. 29-34 and 31-29. They won one of those games, I believe. So again, massively high-scoring games. This is final game totals is 63 and 60. DJ Moore's done it once. Similar to Marvin Harrison Jr., it was a blowout win, but the Bears scored 36 points in that game. DK Metcalf has done it once on 14 targets. Darnell Mooney has done it once in that same game where Drake London did it in the 36-30 game. So point being, we're not just seeing 30-point scores pop up here and there and, this guy's really good and he's just racking up 30-plus points. Now, that might change now that Tyreek Hill has Tua back, and Tyreek Hill last year certainly set a precedence of being able to put up these 30-plus pointers without help from game environment, without monster target shares. But this is what we've been seeing this year, is it's really hard for wide receivers to score 30-plus points because teams are taking away the downfield throws. And so teams are needing massive volume from the passing attacks, massive volume on the individual weapons, high scoring games in order to produce 30-plus DraftKings points. But then most running backs are not producing 30-plus DraftKings points because most backfields are split at this point. We don't need to get into why most backfields are split, but there was a period of time where that was not the case across the NFL, and that directly led to this new meta around the NFL where backfields are split. So what we're seeing is we're not getting a lot of 30-point scores from wide receivers. We're not getting a lot of 30-point scores from running backs. And then on top of that, pricing is high. Basically, like the production profiles that would have been priced in the 5K range last year are now priced in the 6K range. Now, I shouldn't just say last year. I should say over time. The production profiles that would have been priced in the 4K range over time are now priced in the 5K range. So DraftKings has gotten weirdly aggressive with their pricing, where we're not getting a lot of 30-point scores. So it's that much harder to get up to a 200-point score from your roster. I mean, you got, let's say the most you're going to get from a defense is 20, right? And then you've got 8 roster spots from there to get another 180 points in order to get up to a 200-point score, right? So if you're getting, 22.5, I think that is. Like if you're getting 22.5 per player to get up to 200 points, but then you're going to have some players who put up 14, 15, 16. So you need these 30-point scores to get you up to that 200-point score. But we're not seeing as many 30-point scores. And then you're having to pay that much more for those 30-point scores. So look at last week where I had a sweat in the single entry $1,500 contest. Ended up finishing 19th, had a shot at a much higher finish. I wanted, we talked last week about that Minnesota penthouse. I wanted to get Amon-Ra St. Brown and Justin Jefferson on a roster together. Sam Darnold was the quarterback. I was looking for ways all week to fit Brock Bowers on there, but like the pricing was so tight, value was so thin that I wasn't able to do it. In order to make it work on that roster, I was able to get David Njoku in the flex and had to put Johnny Munt in the tight end position at 2,800 and basically tying him into the Sam Darnold bet and saying, well, if I'm betting on Sam Darnold and I'm betting on Justin Jefferson, ideally I'm betting on Sam Darnold ending up with 37, 38 pass attempts, right? Finally breaking above this 30 pass attempt mark he's been stuck at. And then that allows Johnny Munt to, instead of getting 3 or 4 targets, to potentially get 6 or 7 targets at only 2,800. And you can throw in a player like that on a roster like that where you're betting on the quarterback because you're really ideally betting on the quarterback seeing higher volume than normal, and that can trickle down to a player like that. And so it's like, I had to make a sacrifice like that in order to just get a roster together that I liked. And that's kind of what we're seeing now this week. That's totally different because all the value that has opened up, but pricing is so tight on most players. And so examples of some players, and this is in the DFS interpretations, but I want to touch on this in the Angles podcast as well for any of you who are not subscribers or who don't have time to read the NFL Edge. So I'm going to read you a player, their price, their target score, as in 4x their salary multiplier, and then some information about them. So J.K. Dobbins, 6.9K. That means his target score, 27.6. How many times has he hit 27.6 this year? None. He has yet to top 25.9, and he's only cracked 20 points twice. A player who scores 25.9 once has cracked 20 points only twice. That's typically a guy who's priced around 6.1, 6.2K. He's priced at 6.9K. Josh Jacobs, 6.6K. Target score, 26.4. His best game on the season is 20.2, and 4 of his 7 games have produced 13 or fewer DraftKings points. In fact, sub 13 DraftKings points, just below 13 DraftKings points. This is the profile, a guy who's most of the time, more than half the time, he's producing under 13 points. He has yet to crack 20.2. This is the profile of a guy who should be priced at 5,400. He's priced at 6.6K. And I'm just talking about how DraftKings would have priced these guys in the past. We won't hit on every single one of these guys. Tony Pollard, another key one to hit on, 6.5K. Target score, 26. He has cracked 19, or sorry, no, that was James Conner. His best game this season, James Conner has cracked 19 points 4 times. So we skipped over him. Tony Pollard, 6.5K, target score 26. His best game on the season, what is it, 23, 25? He didn't quite get to 26. No, his best game of the season is 18.8 DraftKings points. This is a guy who has not topped 18.8 DraftKings points. He has 6.5K in salary. Once again, the profile now, he's been more consistent, so he should be priced a little bit higher than what we would see Josh Jacobs at. But this is a guy who in the past we would see at like 5.8K. He's 6.5K. So this is, this is my life during football season. I'm kind of like an obsessive personality. So whatever I'm doing during football season, like this is all I'm thinking about outside of Monday when I'm on airplane mode, try to take a break. So like these things are deep in my brain of like how pricing works over the years, what we're supposed to be seeing at these price tags. Like these are very much the price tags we should be seeing on these players based on how DraftKings has handled pricing over the years. So basically, if you're considering Tony Pollard, you can be thinking of him as a player you're not just rostering, but you're rostering at a $700 premium because he should be priced around 5.8K. We can think in terms of this because that allows us to find values where we can say, oh yeah, this guy's 300 underpriced. This guy's 700 underpriced because this is where he really should be priced based on his production profile. So I kind of always touch on this stuff throughout the season, especially as we get to this point in the year. So I don't know, keep listening to my content, reading my content if you kind of want a feel of where all this pricing should be and on various players. Stephon Diggs, 7.5K. Target score 30 plus, right? He's cracked 20 points only once. He's topped out at 21.9 in a 2-touchdown game. He hasn't topped 23 points in 20 consecutive games. He hasn't cracked 100 yards in 20 consecutive games. He should be priced aggressively given his name value at like 6.3, 6.4K. He's 7,500. Terry McLaurin is 6.9K, target score 27.6. He has not hit 24 points yet. Devontae Smith, he's 6.6K. His target score is 26.4. He has gone for 26.4 or better 3 times in 60 career games. 5% of the time, Devontae Smith has hit this score that you're targeting for him, where really he should be priced in such a way that he's hitting his target score about 25% of the time. So what this means is that, and this is what I wanted to get to and what's critical here, is that underpriced players are that much more valuable than they were in the past. Because in the past, you have guys who are appropriately priced and you have guys who are underpriced. Now you have guys who you are spending hundreds to 1,000 plus in additional salary over what you would typically have been spending on them in the past for their production profiles. And then you have guys who are like Tyreek Hill, who really should be priced at about 8,600. So we could say that Tyreek Hill conservatively is 20% underpriced. We could say that a lot of these other guys are 20% overpriced. It is just such a broad spread between a guy like Tyreek Hill and the value he's bringing in these other guys. So underpriced becomes that much more valuable. And then, we also have, we'll dive deeper into this in the player grid. I dove into this in DFS interpretations. Don't want to spend too much time on this here, but we have the Bucks pass catchers. We have the Browns pass catchers. We have some other value that has opened up, right? DK Metcalf is out. Jameson Williams is out. Those don't matter quite as much, but we have other places where value has opened up on this slate. So in places where, and then tight ends are still mispriced, right? So we're in this weird situation where tight ends were always overpriced for their production, but now especially Brock Bowers is kind of appropriately priced, but most other players are 500, 700, 900, 1,000, 1,200 overpriced. So Brock Bowers becomes underpriced, right? So you can call Brock Bowers appropriately priced. You can call David Njoku appropriately priced. You could call Travis Kelce appropriately priced, maybe slightly overpriced. But point being, tight end actually is one of the more valuable positions right now. And so I want to encourage you to think about these things as you're building rosters this week. Already touched on this, that lots of running backs look good. Cheap wide receivers look good. So again, see my player grid for thoughts on how I'm looking at the Buccaneers, how I'm looking at the Browns, how I'm attacking those spots. And then when you're looking at expensive wide receivers, I would encourage you to ask, can this game have a super high score? Or is there a path to this player seeing massive targets? So this last week in the Winner Circle podcast, I went through, I basically went through all 10 games from last week's main slate. and I pulled out like one player per game to just ask a question on, to like as a way to help users assess their play. And so, for example, if you were playing the Rams last week, if you were heavy on that, you got burned if you played the Rams because Colby Parkinson was on the sideline a bunch and Jordan Whittington hardly played. He had the shoulder issue that we didn't know about. So, that hurts you. But also, the Rams were playing the Raiders, and none of these guys were going to do well without volume. They all needed volume in order to hit. What was the pathway you were seeing to these guys having heavy volume? And did you build around that scenario? Did you build where all of your Jordan Whittington rosters tied in with Brock Bowers or Alexander Madison, who, actually I wish I'd had more of him last week. I had like 5% Alexander Madison, 0% Zamir White. Because it was just like, man, he's been so much better than Zamir White. What if he's the lead back? It was actually more obvious than I gave it credit for. And, he was like 0% owned. But tying those guys in with players from the Raiders say, oh, the Raiders are going to do well, and that's going to push the Rams to throw the ball a bunch, and that's why I'm on these Rams pieces, as opposed to just saying, hey, I like the Rams pieces. They could have a good game. And, Stafford ended up throwing the ball 23 times in that spot. And these are the types of things that I want to encourage you to think about. I always call it demystifying the slate, demystifying a player's production. So instead of just saying, oh, this guy is, the example I used in Winner's Circle was, oh, this guy is 6K. Yeah, I think he can have a good game. And it's like, how? How does he have a good game, right? Is he a guy who can hit for is he a Jameson Williams, right? He can see 3 targets and still go for 100 plus yards and a touchdown. Or is he a guy who's going to pick up 7, 9, 10, 12 yards per catch and really needs to catch the ball 80 plus times or I hope you guys are getting entertainment out of this fly issue today. Is he a guy who needs to catch the ball eight times to get 80 yards, right? And then you're hoping for 8 for 80 and a touchdown in order to get him up to 22 points and 2 touchdowns in order to get him up to 28 points. And then you have to think, like, how frequently in this guy's career is he going to score 2 touchdowns? Is it going to happen like once every 4 games? Is it going to happen like if he needs 2 touchdowns in order to produce this 4x score? Is it going to happen once every 4 games? Is it going to happen once every 20 games? Like, is once per season, is this guy going to score 2 touchdowns? Is it going to be once every season and a half, right? If you're rostering a guy who you're like, well, he usually sees 7 or 8 targets, but I think he'd have a good score in this spot, demystify that for yourself a little bit. Why do you think he can have a good score in this spot? Are you just hoping that this guy who usually averages around 10 yards per catch has a broken play and scores a long touchdown and goes for 100 plus yards, gets the bonus and all that? Or are you saying, okay, no, like in this game, they're going to be trailing, but they're still a good team. They should be able to do well when they're trailing. They're going to have to pass the ball a bunch. This guy's going to see more targets than normal. He's going to see 10, 11 targets. He could easily catch 8 for 80 and score a touchdown. That would be a really nice score. And there's not going to be a lot of 20 plus pointers on this particular week. So that kind of lines up as like, this is the type of guy who can play. And maybe he has an outside shot at the 2 touchdown game. Like, think through those things so that you're not just randomly playing players that the name looks good, the matchup looks good. We always want to think about game environment. And in fact, I'll push you on that and say this week in particular, I think game environments matter a lot because I have a very narrow pool, primarily because a lot of these spots, it's like I saw Amon-Ra St. Brown as relatively high projected ownership. And my thought is like, the Lions love to run the ball. In what context do the Titans push the Lions in such a way that Amon-Ra St. Brown against this good Tennessee defense is getting 12 or 13 targets? I'm not saying it can't happen, right? But I'm saying you got to ask yourself these questions because you want players. We're talking about AJ Brown and Jamar Chase, right? These guys could feed off each other and both go for 36 DraftKings points, right? You want guys who, yes, if you get 26, 27, 28 from these guys, you're happy, but you want to be targeting the upside. Upside is what wins tournaments. So if they don't have the upside to 33, 35 plus points, you're really hurting yourself. So you want to ask yourself, not just can Amon-Ra St. Brown get 24, 26, but like also what are his chances of getting 35, 36? I'm not saying he can't do it, but I'm saying tell the story of how that happens. Think through that before you play these guys. So with expensive wide receivers, we look through those numbers. I want to encourage you to ask, can they have a super high score or can they see massive targets in this particular game environment? And then ask, how should you play them? So if Jamar Chase and AJ Brown are in a game with a super high score and massive target volume, it stands to reason that if Jamar Chase is in that type of game, then AJ Brown or Saquon Barkley is also in that type of game. If AJ Brown is in that type of game. It stands to reason that Jamar Chase and maybe Chase Brown, maybe T. Higgins are in that type of game. So think through how you're playing these guys this week. Okay, we'll leave the rest of player-specific stuff to the player grid. You can find that in the scroll. It'll be up by the time you're reading this. It should be live in the scroll. Or by the time you're listening to this, watching this, it's going to be up around 5:15 or so Eastern. So let's get to the bottom up build. So for those of you who are new here, bottom up build, we build with a 44K salary cap. It's a really cool thought exercise just to allow us to think through some of the value on the slate and to allow us to talk through some individual players I want to highlight. Also, if we get a chance to touch on some strategy about like how we're putting this roster together, why we're putting it together, the way we're putting it together. If you want to participate in a contest with a 44K salary cap, build this way yourself. We have a bottom-up build challenge on OWS. You can find the link in my player grid or in the BUB challenge channel on the OWS Discord server. It's free to enter. There are real prizes to the top 3 spots. So $150, 150 edge points, which is, each edge point equals $1 basically on OWS. So $150 on OWS, I think 150 are the top 3 prizes on that. So free contest and just a really cool way to be active in the community and participate and build one of these. Do this with Anthony Richardson because in terms of ceiling, I think Anthony Richardson, I like Bo Nix this week. He's probably going to score 18 to 22 DraftKings points. He's probably not going to score 30 DraftKings points, right? And so I like Jameis Winston this week. What I like about Jameis Winston is Bo Nix is going to get a lot of the last week, Mariota and Jaden Daniels had an easy time running against this Carolina defense on designed run plays. Bo Nix is a big part of the designed run game for the Broncos. So you see his rushing attempts, if you look through his game logs, a lot of those are not scrambles. A lot of those are designed runs. So Sean Payton is going to look at that film and say, okay, here are some ways that we can exploit this defense, right? It won't be surprising if Bo Nix has 50 rushing yards in this one. But because of that, his good game, right? I think he hasn't topped 236 passing yards is the number. And he's topped 212 passing yards, something like that one time. So Bo Nix's big game isn't necessarily helping you get multiple spots right, or his 22, 23 pointer isn't helping you get multiple spots in your roster, correct? So I actually like Jameis Winston more. We'll save the deeper discussion on Jameis for the player grid. If you're on OWS, you've read it in the DFS interpretations, you'll read it in the player grid. But I like Jameis more because he has these cheap wide receivers, and because of all the things that we hit on in the player grid, you would expect Jameis to be throwing the ball a lot in this spot against a team that allows a lot of downfield passing. We know Jameis likes to attack downfield, and a team that gives up a lot of downfield production. So if you get Jameis right, you have these cheap wide receivers who are tailing Jameis, and you can probably get 2 additional spots on your roster correct along with Jameis Winston. So, but I also wanted to try to fit Anthony Richardson on this because Anthony Richardson, he's in the Bo Nix category. And Bo Nix, you can pair him with Courtland Sutton, you can pair him with Troy Franklin, and you probably get close to 4X with that guy if you pick the right guy and if Bo Nix goes for 22, right? The problem with the Sean Payton offense is also you never know who's going to score the touchdowns. It could be the random guy who plays 5 snaps a game scores the touchdowns. We saw that all the time in New Orleans. We see that here with the Broncos. So you also could play Bo Nix. He could get 23. You pair him with Courtland Sutton, and Courtland Sutton gets 11 or 12. You pair him with Troy Franklin, and Troy Franklin gets 3 or 4, right? That can happen as well. And it could be no pass catcher that you're supposed to pair with Bo Nix. A lot of question marks on that one, which kind of just lowers the value of the Bo Nix play. Again, I like him, but he's not as high on my list as Jameis or Anthony Richardson. Anthony Richardson, who similarly kind of is you're just getting Anthony Richardson right, but you also with Anthony Richardson, you're probably not even trying to guess on who to pair him with. You're probably just playing Anthony Richardson naked and saying, I'm treating him like a one-off play, but I'm treating him like a one-off play with a 5,800 price tag that can go for 30 DraftKings points. I don't expect Jameis to go for 30 DraftKings points. I don't expect Bo Nix to go for 30 DraftKings points. And so if Anthony Richardson bombs, he bombs. But if he goes for 30, you are leapfrogging these other cheap quarterbacks. And so he's a very interesting way to approach this slate this week. Anthony Richardson, tried to get him on this roster. Just didn't quite work out the way that I wanted to build it. So Jameis Winston is on this roster. We'll get to the pairings with him here in just a moment. Tyreek Hill is on this roster. And I went ahead and paired Jameis with Cedric Tillman and Jerry Jeudy. So I broke this down in DFS interpretations, but I believe it was the second pass of the game for the Browns last week. Tillman was the underneath route on an over-under route concept where typically you typically read those from the top down. The quarterback rolls out, there's an over route and an under route, and you read those from the top down. So the downfield guy is the first guy you're reading, but oftentimes it's the underneath guys who you end up throwing to because the downfield guy is covered. So you quickly look downfield. If he's covered, you throw it to the underneath guy. So Tillman was kind of the second read on that, but also like prioritized on that play. A couple plays later, he was the first read on a downfield crossing route. And then all throughout that game, he was the first read. Fantasy Points had him tracked with 10 first read targets, which tied David Njoku in the offense. Tillman had 10 targets before Jerry Jeudy had 1 target in that game. Tillman had a play where Deshaun Watson was lined up at wide receiver and then came like it was an end around and they tossed it to him. And the play was designed to try to get Tillman open on a downfield shot. So it was like the playbook was very much geared toward getting the ball to Cedric Tillman. So really like Cedric Tillman this week. And I'm treating him as the wide receiver 1 in this offense now that Amari Cooper is gone. Now that could have just been a 1-game sample. We also have a change in play callers this week, which is kind of weird. It's kind of its own thing, but it's weird because they brought in Ken Dorsey because his offense is a better fit for Deshaun Watson's supposed strengths, but then it was Kevin Stefanski calling Ken Dorsey's offense with Deshaun Watson at quarterback. Now Deshaun Watson's gone and they're like, let's take play calling off of our 2-time coach of the year's hands, who did great with a similar style quarterback in Joe Flacco last year. Let's give it over to Ken Dorsey now that it's an offense that doesn't fit as well with what he does. But that can maybe trip things up and things can get thrown off. But the other thing I want to think about too, so first off, schemed routes, right? We schemed usage. We always want to pay attention to that. So Cedric Tillman stands out to me there. But also Jerry Jeudy, Jameis came in. Jeudy had 0 targets. 5 passes later, Jeudy had 3 targets. Immediately, Jameis started throwing the ball to Jerry Jeudy. 5 of Jameis's 11 passes went to Jerry Jeudy. So that could have just been trying to appease him. I don't know, but he was looking to Jeudy in that spot. So I think Judy's going to go kind of overlooked this week for his potential to see a heavy target share. So obviously, David Njoku, I really like him this week. He's going to be popular this week, but this kind of allows us to play things differently. As Pete pointed out in the block party, most people who play Jameis are probably going to just auto play Njoku. Already, Jameis won't be popular, and then most of those rosters will have Njoku, which also means most of them won't have Cade Otton. So Cade Otton on this roster gives us a unique way to play Cade Otton. We're playing Cade Otton instead of the Buccaneers wide receivers on this roster, so it gives us a little bit of leverage there. So this starting point is Jameis Winston, Cedric Tillman, Jerry Jeudy, Tyreek Hill, Cade Otton. If this were a 50K salary cap roster, I'd probably be looking to have a running back or tight end in the flex here. Tight end as in one of those more expensive guys, Brock Bowers, possibly Travis Kelce, but and then obviously not Njoku on this roster because we've already got Jeudy and Tillman. But and then can't get up to a running back, can't get up to one of those guys. So we're gonna go Troy Franklin here. We're gonna go Broncos defense. I'm willing to pay up a defense this week, even on a 44K salary cap roster. And then at running back, we have DeAndre Swift and Javonte Williams. Just 2 of the guys who are in this bucket for me. Kareem Hunt is also in this bucket for me. I've mentioned some of the other guys who are in this bucket for me. The player grid has my full running back list, but I'm not taking a stance on DeAndre Swift. I'm not taking a stance on Javonte Williams. I'm saying I like these guys among the guys that I like. And so just throw them onto the roster. End up spending $43.8K in salary. That gives us $6.2K in salary left over. And I've been talking for an hour, and my thoughts are starting to get jumbled up in my mouth. So with that, we are going to call it quits on this week's Angles podcast. Here in a few minutes, I will be on Roto Grinders with Squirrel Patrol. So by the time you're watching this, that will be available. I always forget to mention that all of our off-site podcasts and videos are linked at the bottom of the scroll. And then there's also an OWS offsite tab I think it's in the OWS drop-down menu on the site. So you can actually go there and find links to any of the other shows that we are on. But with that, I'll get out of here. I will see you on the site throughout the weekend, and I'll see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.